Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo, Toledo, Ohio.
If we look at these two groups that we've been talking about here, these dependent people that we might see as too passive in the church, this theology of baptism we're talking about and this notion of the church would say to them, you know, okay, let's assume more of a role here. We don't have all the answers. We as clergy can't pretend like we've got all the answers. You have to learn to think for yourself. We want to be with you in the process and maybe help you to move in that direction. We don't want to abandon you, but couldn't we take some steps in that direction where you would make more decisions on your own and be less dependent, take more initiative within the parish community and so on.
Joining Father Bacik in today's reflections is Bishop James Huffman, who is Bishop of the Diocese of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik and Bishop Huffman will discuss the relationship of laity and clergy. Here's Father Bacik.
Bishop Huffman, it's awfully good of you to take time out from your busy schedule to come and do this program with me today. I know that I would like to talk a little bit about the role of the laity in the church, and it strikes me that you are a good one to have on the program here, since I believe it is one of your jobs as the chairman of the Bishop's Committee on the Laity, not so?
Sure.
And
I'm delighted to be here, and I think the fact that you invited me on the topic of laity suits me quite well.
You know, we could talk about the topic of bishops, but also,
well,
but I think that
not on this occasion.
Yeah, right. Let's not do that. Let's talk about laity. Okay, and your role with the Bishop's Committee certainly, I know, puts you in a good position to talk about that. And I should remind you of the rules of the program here. I sort of take the lead as we talked about it, and you don't have to do that. You're just in a responding position today. How does that sound?
I feel comfortable with that.
I know you do. That's good. Let's talk a little bit, therefore, about how laity do relate to clergy in our church. And I suppose we'll be talking out of our Catholic perspective, but I don't doubt that it will have resonances with people in other religious bodies as well, as the lay people, the members of the communities interact with their leaders in one way or another. As I'm looking at that, I'm thinking that some of the lay people that we end up dealing with are really in a quite dependent position. We find them coming to us for advice about everything, including sexual matters and business matters, often things that we have very little knowledge of or expertise in. We find them at times, I suppose, being in what we would think of as an overly dependent position, as perhaps not thinking for themselves or being too passive or expecting answers from us that we really can't give. I wonder if we might not just talk about that for a few minutes.
Sure. Well, one of the things that strikes me is that at least the Catholic Church in the United States is rather young. And when we look at the growth of the Church, we realize that there was a great mass of immigration, and during many of those waves of immigration, the sort of educated person in the community happened to be the parish priest. Consequently, I think at least in the United States there was a dependence developed, not simply in regard to religious matters, but legal advice and financial advice. And I would say, though, for the past 30 or 40 years, that that certainly has begun to shift. And I think the call of the Council has really challenged us to move away from the kind of dependency that one experienced into much more of a kind of a collaboration.
Yes, I like the point. The historical point seems important to me to keep in mind. That really the pastor of the parish probably was the one who could write the letters back to Europe for the people and help them get jobs and so on. You know what I was thinking? There's a positive side to that as well, it seems, and that is the great respect that the clergy has enjoyed among those people. I really feel sometimes as though we stand on the shoulders of people who really served their congregations, I mean, in a concrete way, in a social context, in terms of getting them jobs, and just keeping the fabric of their culture together. And they build up this tremendous fund of goodwill, I think. And sometimes I think we're surprised at the way the lay people will treat the clergy with such respect and thing. And I think they are drawing on a memory there of their grandparents and parents who really had something to be grateful for, I think.
The aspect in which I remember experiencing that was Whenever I would receive a new assignment to go to a different parish, the whole sense of trust, which one sort of inherited, always impressed me with the idea it was the goodwill and the service that had been provided by those who had gone before me that created that. Consequently, unless you lost it, the only way to go was up, and people would even trust you more, so that after 6 months the relationship was probably as strong as a relationship might be in other situations after 4 or 5 years.
I think sometimes young clergy have sort of never gotten over that initial experience. In other words, you come out of the seminary situation where you really don't have much status or position or anything like that, and then suddenly you're thrust into this world where you have this great respect all around you. Sometimes I have a feeling that clergy don't ever recover from that in a way. They're put up on a pedestal, and maybe they just want to stay there as a result of this adulation they've received suddenly. It is culture shock. I can remember that when I first went to a parish out of the seminary.
The only thing I would say to young clergy is that it can be lost. While I think the trust starts out at a very high and a very strong level, if the person doesn't have competence, if the person doesn't have the ability in regard to preaching the word or in regard to proclaiming the gospel, I don't think it ends up being automatic in those circumstances. But at least the initial reception is one that's very strong, and if one has the gifts to build on that, it's very helpful, I think, both to the minister and to the people being ministered to.
Right, it really creates a bond that I think facilitates growth on both parts if you're able to work at it correctly. I know you and I have encountered other people who feel quite differently about this. They aren't in any kind of dependent and passive position, but they want great independence vis-a-vis the clergy, the hierarchy. They want to be able to do their own thing as lay people. In fact, I think you and I both heard one talking about all we want is stay out of our way. Don't get in the way. We've got things we want to do. We've got our understanding of Christianity. We've got our Catholic heritage. We want to run with it, and we want to make a difference in our world and accomplish things. And our sense is, as they're saying, is that the clergy are in our way somehow, or that we don't want to be dependent on them, and we're going to function autonomously here. And I think, as some of them said, they didn't really care what the hierarchy was saying all that much. But they had it within themselves to take hold of this. Now, that represents quite I think, a new situation in our own Catholic community, and I suspect in other congregations as well.
I remember some years ago when I was involved with the prior laity committee under Bishop Ottenweller, and we were developing sort of a basic statement which came out, and it was called Called and Gifted, the American Catholic Laity. And I think everybody in the committee was convinced that they are indeed called and gifted. But one of the sections in there had to do with adulthood, because I think that as we looked back to the prior relationship we were talking about, it was almost child to parent. And I think what we find nowadays, whether we call it independence or autonomous, I think it really is an adult relationship that many of our people are looking to have with their spiritual guides, so that they no longer want to be told what to do in regard to matters perhaps pertaining to business or things that relate to economics. I think that often comes up in our church when clergy take positions in regard to issues of social justice. I think it ends up, and I think I can understand that as they move away from looking to Father for all the questions, and we've encouraged that. Certainly we've encouraged it, I think, in terms of the development of personal conscience and moving away from sort of a casuistic approach to moral questions. And I suspect that at some point it could be exaggerated, but at this stage I see that as a healthy growth toward sort of an adult acceptance of faith.
I suppose we could think of the general model of growth to adulthood as always including sort of an adolescent phase, sort of necessarily so, in which one has to define oneself over against the dominant group. I had that impression as we listened to some lay people talking in that way, that this is a necessary phase. In other words, they have to say a strong no to dominance on the part of the clergy and define themselves strongly against that tradition that they grew up in. as I would hear that, I would be thinking, you know, that's okay, and let's live with that now, and let's each go our own direction. But eventually what we would hope to be in is a much more cooperative kind of posture, where we could trust one another, work together on the basis of mutuality and a certain equality within the church.
Mm-hmm. I suspect that as individual lay people have the experience, they do it in different ways. Just as we experience adolescence in different ways. For some people, it's really a banging around period, whereas for others, it isn't nearly as traumatic. And my reflection upon lay people is that it goes the whole gamut. But I think it's a necessary period, particularly as we look back to the early part of this century. I think it could have been anticipated. And some might want to interpret that as a kind of anti-clericalism. I don't think that it has that characteristic. I think, at least my experience in this country, that's not been very significant in contrast to some of the European countries. And I think, on the other hand, there's a healthy challenge to we who are priests and clergy in terms of our relationship, because whereas our predecessors as members of the clergy were perhaps the most or the best educated, I think that we deal with an extremely educated congregation and group of lay people. I think it's important for us to not exaggerate what our own gifts and talents are, to be quite open to the acceptance of their insights, particularly in their areas of expertise.
I wonder if the whole democratic situation here in the United States doesn't have an influence on this. The general sense that we are all citizens and have an equality before the law, and that we're supposed to be participating in the structures that govern us and so on. I wonder if there isn't a little carryover into the church along this line, that people just, the people who do sort of get enlightened and move in this more adult way away from a passive dependency, perhaps are thinking a little bit in terms of these democratic structures of having a vote on things, a say in things, and wanting to be part of the process and making sure that their voice is heard in the way things operate. I think that we see that happening in a lot of parishes these days, I think. And church has always, throughout history, sort of taken on the structures of the society in which it lived. It's mirrored them or reflected them in one way or another. So my guess is that the more democratic system in which we live will have an influence on this whole process.
Oh, I think we could pick out examples in our present certain aspects and phases of parish life where that would be confirmed, namely that being citizens of this country and growing up in a democracy, we tend to translate that in regard to our behavior in relationship with church institutions or church structures. I think at times it becomes a source of tension when we find out that the church, in fact, does have set doctrine, and that everything is not up for a vote, doesn't depend on majority in that sense. But I think, again, believing people have a sense of that because they live under the gospel, and they know that we don't vote scriptures up and down, but we accept them as revelation, God speaking to us and calling us beyond. But
so the whole democratic idea would always be in tension with, or in some sort of interaction with, our general sense of how the church functions as a whole.
I would say that I've experienced some of that.
It's exactly the way it goes.
I see that to be a healthy tension. I don't see that as something that we would like to eradicate.
Again, that's part of our history, isn't it? We've had the important bishops in the 19th century who kept saying that the American experience was valid and that it would be good for the church. I think sometimes people in Rome had a hard time understanding that, and we had the whole charge of Americanism at one time. But surely in the Second Vatican Council, I think a lot of that came out in the Religious Liberty document and the great influence that John Courtney Murray had and the American bishops had in trying to get across this idea of general freedom within the society and the culture, and that the church wouldn't demand privilege. And at the same time, I think that some of those freedom ideals and democratic principles would flow into the church itself. So I think our position has always been that enriches the church, and I would certainly like to think of it that way.
Well, as I look back at those who helped shape the church in the 19th century, Some were much more visionary than others. And when you made the reference earlier, Archbishop Ireland came to my mind. And I think there was a great sense among some churchmen that the environment in the United States was healthy for religion, that one did not need some kind of absolute protection, that rather if one had an environment of freedom where one was free to worship and free to proclaim the gospel, that it proved to be very good. At the same time, I think we sense that there's a kind of a competitiveness in our pluralistic environment, which also can be seen as a benefit in proclaiming the gospel. So, and I certainly agree that out of that experience of the church in this country and the reflections of John Courtney Murray, the decree, the document on religious liberty, in the Second Vatican Council is, I think, without question, the contribution of the, I suppose we could say, infant church of the United States.
And I think one we can really be proud of, and probably begins to take sway in other parts of the world, and probably one of our contributions to the total Christian world, I would think.
I think at the present time, it occurs to me that there may still be some non-acceptance of some of the elements of that particular decree, in spite of the fact that it received the approval and was voted as part of our pastoral approach to church life.
I guess that's one of the good things about having documents like that, is one can go back to them and call out the members of the church to live out the best of the ideals that have been stated. I think we do that in this country all the time with our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, and so on. We go back to those founding documents and say, hey, there's ideals here that we don't live out and that we are called to. I would think that the council documents function that way in large measure. Of course, we had a whole document on the laity, too, out of the Second Vatican Council that we probably could allude to.
Well, I think I find it a little sad that the content of that particular document isn't developed much, as I see it, following the council. Of course, that would be a topic for maybe another show, because of what it sort of calls the laity toward in regard to their own response to the world. On the notion of laity, I had some correspondence recently from someone who is a theologian and pointed out, because I was the chairman of the Committee on Laity, he wondered if we could get sort of a moratorium on the word laity and
I was just thinking that same thing. Yeah.
Well, he, of course, went back and traced it back to the Greek, and it was a badge of honor. It was a very positive acclamation. My experience in serving on the committee and interacting with maybe more assertive lay persons in the American church is some people almost take that to be something demeaning. Now, it might be because the words either clergy or hierarchy seem to be given different value, but if we could reclaim the positive meaning of being laicos in the church, I think that that would be a healthy development.
You know what? I think the reason that they don't want that term now is because of this kind of sociological analysis. That is, the dominant group in any society, any grouping, organization, always dictates the categories in which the debate is carried on. They always decide what the rules of discourse are and what the terminology is that will prevail. And I think that's true. And any oppressed group then says, hey, we don't want the dominant group to define that for us. We want to do that ourselves. So I don't think inherently there's anything wrong with the word laity. In fact, it's a beautiful word. It just means the people, from the Greek, the people who are the member of the church. But I believe the rub comes, at least on the part of some more radicalized laity, is they don't want the dominant group, which they think of as the hierarchy, the clergy, defining them in that way. If they thought of the term themselves, it would be fine. And if they decided this is how we want to be called, then they would be at ease with it. This problem of terminology is terrific, isn't it? I sometimes think you can't talk anymore, I mean, some groups, it's hard to find any language that's really acceptable. But I just learned this last week, I think, this analysis of the way groupings work within any organization, and that rings a lot of bells with me. I think that does fit with where a lot of laity would be. They don't want to be called laity because that's the bishop's term for them, or that's the priest's term for them. Let them think of how they want to be defined themselves.
I think another another aspect of perhaps the use of the word, or the sort of assumed demeaning expression, might come too because of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, where the church was looked at in a very hierarchical model in terms of the way in which the categories were evolved. And when the code got down to laity, it had very little to say. Some of that might be reversed with the new revised code, because, as we know, we're all talked about as the people of God. That's the broad category, and that's the privilege we share together. Then, in order to make some distinctions between vowed and non-vowed, or between celibate and married, or whatever, we come up to some other terms or terminology. But while I certainly accept the analysis you offer, it occurred to me as I was listening that maybe past experience as codified had some small role in that,
yeah,
too.
I see that point. You know, when we begin to think about positive ways of dealing with either this great dependency or this maybe excessive sense of autonomy that we find at times, in trying to work out a more cooperative basis, I think that the theological world really can help us here as we reflect on our scriptures and tradition. It seems as though the basis for all this really could be found in a notion of baptism, for example, where baptism is our common initiation into the community of Christ, and as we're baptized into that community, we have a certain equality with everyone else. We receive the life of Jesus Christ, and we are called the sons and daughters of the Father's Spirit at work in us, and out of that common baptism, we are then given a co-responsibility for the community, so that our lay people, if we're going to still use that term, are not called upon to do something in the church because you, the bishop, ask them to do it, but or allow them to do it, which would be even a worse terminology, I suppose, but because they have that inherent right, because they are a member of the church, because they got something to contribute out of their own unique gifts and their talents, the training they've had, the experience. So that seems to me, if we could get that straight, both among clergy and among laity, then we probably would begin to function in a more cooperative basis, because we'd be saying, hey, we're sitting here as with a fundamental equality about us, and we all have our gifts and talents, our charisms, as the Scriptures call it, to contribute to the group.
I think there's been some progress. I remember when I was a student in the seminary, and Catholic action was sort of an important notion, and they always defined it as the participation of the laity in the apostolate of the hierarchy, whereas, and that would go back to the 40s, whereas in the called and gifted statement, American Catholic Laity, the precise point you've made is that the point is that we are baptized, and because we are baptized and confirmed in the Lord Jesus Christ, that's what gives us responsibility for the mission. And I think you're right. I think that we need to use that common ground. And I don't think we all want to do each other's tasks, nor do I think we all bring the same competence. So that the challenge to be cooperative or collaborative or co-responsible will be a growing concept. The other thing I think I've simply learned from being a parish priest is to trust the people. It's amazing as you allow things to sort of evolve even in a parish community. And usually that happens among the people who are imbued with faith. I mean, they're usually the ones who are involved and active. And you don't always agree with everything that's stated or everything that's said in a given occasion, but you look back over 2 or 3 years of faith-filled people, I think there's a very clear sense in which that intuition they have, and I think from the Spirit, should be trusted.
Now, that's a traditional notion again, isn't it? The sense of the faithful, we called that. All throughout our Christian history, there's been a strong sense that the faithful are the bearers of the truth in a way. Even in the Second Vatican Council, we had it. The whole people of God, anointed as they are by the Spirit, cannot err in matters of faith. And so I think a very traditional notion which is being revived. And I like the way you said that out of your own experience, that you really saw that actually working, which I think is, I've seen that too in my own experience. I guess my own experience as a priest has been one in which I always received inspiration from the lay people. I've never had that sort of problem where it said that, you know, people didn't want to do anything or that they weren't involved or active. I've often found that if you just create a little space or show some openness, that people are there. My early experiences in the priesthood are filled with that, of people calling them, saying, let's do this, let's do that, I got this new idea, and that's a dominant sense of my own experience on it. And I think I would be corroborating what you said there out of my own experience as well. Mm-hmm. I think that if we look at these two groups that we've been talking about here, these dependent people that we might see as too passive in the church, this theology of baptism we're talking about and this notion of the church would say to them, you know, okay, let's assume more of a role here. We don't have all the answers. We as clergy can't pretend like we've got all the answers. You have to learn to think for yourself. We want to be with you in the process and maybe help you to move in that direction. We don't want to abandon you, but couldn't we take some steps in that direction where you would make more decisions on your own and be less dependent, take more initiative within the parish community and so on?
I think I think that particular thrust would be wholesome. It does depend upon the leadership and the local community, and I think that we're all somewhat shaped by both our education and our experience, and while I think that many have made great effort to accept the directives of the Council, I think some of the prior styles of pastoral leadership are going to remain, so that I see the evolution occurring over a longer period of time.
Okay, yes, I'm just watching the time, Bishop, and realizing that we don't have a long time to wind this up yet. I have to do a quick summary. I want to thank you first for coming on the program, and I appreciate that very much. You are a terrific dialoguer and a great listener, one of your great gifts. I appreciate that.
Well, you picked a good topic for me. Thanks.
Right. Okay, and I think that what we've seen in general is the whole idea of the role of the laity and trying to look at that positively and to try to get a sense of cooperation about all of that, where the clergy and laity can work together to build the kingdom on this earth, and so that our church really is a sign of what it's supposed to be, a sign of the presence of the Lord who showered his love on all of us.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo, Toledo, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Bishop James Hoffman, Bishop of the Diocese of Toledo. The topic of this week's reflection was the relationship of laity and clergy. Comments or questions on this show or suggestion for future topics should be sent to Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Campaign of the Diocese of Toledo.